In just a minute. Psalm 131.
Also, I just have one more purpose. We have an auto spark that we go to all the time, and I'm going to go around to him tomorrow. His name is Tony. I want to try and invite him as well. I think on himself.
All right.
Yeah, so I'll just get Tony.
Really appreciate all those who have invited and done an effort to try and get someone in the house of God on Sunday. Fantastic. Really good. That's wonderful. That's why we're going to come pray tomorrow if you can. Like I said, we're specifically going to pray tomorrow night. Tonight and also tomorrow for Sunday. And we're going to give the gospel as much as we can that particular day in the morning. Remember, lunch. And then be also reminded that it's down as a 2 o'clock service, but if we get done and everyone's just milling around at like 1 o'clock or 1:15, then we'll just start at 1:30. Like we're not locked into that 2 o'clock because I don't think anyone's coming for the 2 o'clock. It's just those that wish to stay around for the 2 o'clock. So we'll do that. We may bring that a bit forward as well. Psalm 131, 3 little verses, not a big one. Sometimes little chapters are good because they're easy, because there's just like Psalm 117. Praise the Lord, all you nations. Praise ye the Lord. Like it's like, okay, I know what to do here. And then you get little ones like this, and it's like, where are you going with this? Is not much to work with. But I'm interested to see what thoughts you have tonight. Psalm 131, a song of degrees of David, or as one of the commentators said, it's by David and of David. Like, this is his life. It's we're reading here. Lord, my heart is not haughty, nor mine eyes lofty, neither do I exercise myself in great matters, or in things too high for me. Surely I have behaved and quieted myself as a child that is weaned of his mother. My soul is even as a weaned child. Let Israel hope in the Lord from henceforth and forever. That's it. Just 3 verses. Does not mean coffee time, cow. Are you new here? Thoughts, comments, feedbacks? I don't know what to answer that one. And Kurong, I've noticed as well. No. Cole.
It's an interesting chapter. I read it a few times last week and then a few times this week, and I kind of it's almost like if you read it and you don't understand the context of who's talking, it's almost like he's being prideful about not being prideful. Like it comes across as my heart is not haughty, and it's not. It just sounds a bit out of place. But I was just thinking more and more about David and the man who's writing it. David was a little shepherd boy, and he was just in the field, and he was looking after the sheep, and he never sought out to be king. He never actually sought to be the king or to, be in charge of Israel or lead on the armies and kill Goliath and all these different things. It was actually God that sought him out and chose him because he had that heart where, he didn't want to be the greatest person on the earth. Like, he just wanted to serve God, and he just wanted to live a quiet, happy life with God. And God chose him. He sought him out. He took him from the sheepfolds and he put him as the king of Israel, and he, put him in such a position where everybody, sang about him and lifted up his name, and he was praised, and everybody, even the Jews still say that he was the best king that they ever had back in the day. But he never actually sought to be that person who he was. He never sought to have the notoriety or the position that he had.
Yeah. And it is definitely like you have the publican. You have the publican who says, I thank thee, O God, that I am not like this. The Pharisee, that said, I'm not like the publican. And you can, I don't know why they're different, but you read that and it oozes arrogance. Where this, as you read it, you can tell that there's a different spirit behind the statements in it for sure. And it is interesting that you make the point that David never sought out to be king. He was just, God chose him took him from the sheepfold, the Bible says, which I heard someone say this. Actually, it was Pastor Davison one time speaking to the student body there at Heartland where I was going. He said, learn this, students. He says, you do not need to promote yourself or advertise yourself. Or I can't remember the word he says. He says, God knows where you are. And I thought, and he says, you don't need to send your resume out to here and put all this different stuff. And he says, God knows where you are. He knows where to find you. You just serve him where you are. And that's that's David right there. He never used David, but that's David. God knew where David was, knew how to find him, knew how to get to him, and he became king. Never had to write his resume. God knows where you are. God promotes people. Any other thoughts here, Jackie?
When I was reading the first part, that's exactly what I was thinking of was the sort of that God's ways are simple. It was just the word simple kept kind of jumping out to me. You know, there's nothing arrogant or there's nothing, you know, high and mighty about it. That you know, God's ways are very, very, very simple. This second part, what I was thinking about was, is that there's huge satisfaction in, you know, in God's word. It's like, you know, that where it says there, I have behaved and quieted myself as a child that is weaned of his mother. My soul is even as a weaned child. Like a weaned child is satisfied and nourished, you know, and basically, you know, that the writer, or that we should be nourished, we should be satisfied. God's word is simple, and that we should be satisfied, you know, in the ways of God and following God and in God's word. That's just what it spoke to me.
Yeah.
Pretty much along those lines. I just felt like the first two verses are very much David's introspection on his life, where he's come from, pretty much what Cottle has said, and where he is at the present moment, and that he is not haughty, he's not puffed up, he's not proud. He's very much happy with where he is and the way his life is going and his position. He's not, he knows that God is in control. And he's, as Jackie said, he's like a weaned child. And I thought, weaned, I mean, I know in the Bible times, I think their child was a lot older than what we would consider a weaned child, but someone who's able to stand on their own 2 feet. They don't have to rely on anybody else, human-wise. They are able to feed themselves. They're able to do what he needs to do to run the country. And then I thought the last verse seemed a little bit out of context, but then I thought, in his introspection, he has this deep desire, and that is that Israel would follow the Lord, that Israel would have their hope in the Lord as he has, that they would follow his lead. It just felt like that one.
Yeah.
Mine went on a little different tangent because my Bible referenced Matthew 18:3, and it said,
Yes.
"Verily I say unto you, except you be converted and become as a little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom." It's like a weaned child is someone they're not exactly they're not still on solely milk, but they're able to have solid food. So, and that's as you mature, and I guess as he's referencing a child as in a weaned child, meaning they're not just milk, they're actually able to take solid food, but they're still unlearned, they're still learning things, like they're not high and lofty. Once someone leaves school, you know, we know everything, but they're still an unlearned child, so they're still learning and humbling themselves.
There's another verse in Matthew I thought you were going to where it says that, maybe I didn't put it in here. I'll try and think of that verse where it talks about all the high things. They haven't revealed it to the knowledge, you've revealed it to what's that verse? You've revealed it unto the babes. And you've revealed it unto the foolish and hidden it from the wise, kind of verse. But anyway, any other comments here before I give you what I got here? Josh?
I think just very similar to what everyone else has said tonight, but I couldn't help think of him, like Cottle said before, about is he being very prideful in this situation. But if you think about him looking on who Saul was, and then also on his son Absalom as well, men that were very haughty and lofty with their eyes and just trying to exercise themselves, or especially like his son trying to take control and be the judge. And through everything out of that, where he says, my soul is even as a weaned child, I just see a very mature man that's serving God, that's humbling himself. And then, just like Mrs. Hurst said at the end there, he just points everyone back to God and says, let Israel hope in the Lord. It's not like I am king and this is where I am. Like, just hope in God, not in me. But yeah, pretty much what everyone said tonight has just been a mixture of everything. So,
Any other thoughts?
That verse is in Matthew 11:25. It says, Jesus praying, he says, I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and the prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes.
Yeah, the lofty things that people deal with. Any other last thoughts? Not the time to scratch your ear. All right. Thank you, Connor. It definitely is. Remember this, the songs of degrees are about the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, maybe for those feast days. So they start out, those very early ones have started out from where he's from and those that are slandering them. And then the next one is he's got his face towards Jerusalem on this journey. And then they build, and there's ascensions in there. Well, this particular psalm is sort of the highest elevation of sorts of all the psalms. Now, if you read, there's three more of all the ascension psalms. There's three more, but 32, 33, and 34 all have to do with the house of God, the actual temple. So it's like they've arrived at their destination, which ultimately wasn't Jerusalem, it was the temple to worship God. So in elevation status, actual altitude, this is the highest of their points. Remember just 2 psalms ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was like a plateau and they look back over their journey of where they've come and how God has brought them. And then now he's kind of at the gates, maybe in Jerusalem at the highest point of their journey. And it's interesting to note that in the Christian journey, the highest point, the highest is lowly, which it is. As you mature as a Christian, as you go up in maturity, you go down in pride and you go down in these things that are so normal for everyone else, that these things should become part of the Christian walk. Lowliness is the character trait. And David is exemplifying this. He says, I used to be very haughty. I used to walk around and talk in things that I really had no idea about. And I used to have great opinions about a whole range of different things. He says, my heart is not haughty, nor mine eyes lofty, neither do I exercise myself in great matters or in things too high for me. But he says, what he's saying is that I used to. There was a time where I would exercise myself in great matters and try and sound smart and sound educated and as if I knew everything that was going on. And he said I was like that. And he says there was times I exercised my things in things too high for me. I was watching a video about a week ago and I rewatched it today because it reminded me of this when I was reading it. And it was Elon Musk, the Tesla guy, Elon Musk talking on rocket science. A class on rocket science. These two people were interviewing him, and he was talking about rocket science. And this is some of the things that he was talking about. And he was talking about his rocket science and the SpaceX program, and about how if you followed anything of the SpaceX program, where they're putting their rockets into space, orbiting, and then landing them back down again. And he was talking about that, and he started talking about orbital dynamics. And he was talking about velocity horizontal to the Earth's surface. And then he went on to explain that how in orbit, our outward radial acceleration is equal to our inward acceleration of gravity. And I was watching Elon Musk explain this as if this is how it is. And I did think that. Thought, why are you even explaining this? Seems just self-evident, is it not? That the outward orbit of the radial acceleration is equal to the inward acceleration of gravity. And I was thinking, my oh my, I know what they talk about when they say, I'm not a rocket scientist. And I'm very glad to say, I ain't a rocket scientist. I had no idea what he was talking about. And he was talking, well, there's things and about, anyway. And I just remember thinking that and looking back over this verse, and I think sometimes we try and delve into matters like that, isn't it? The person who is lofty and has is proud often likes to talk about things like they know it and they don't really know anything. That's the proud person. They want to have an opinion. What's the proud person? They have an opinion about everything. Isn't that old saying that opinions are like armpits? Everyone has them and most of them stink. That's a great way of looking at opinions. Everyone has them. But the proud talks about things as if they have their finger on the pulse and they really know nothing about it. There was a man, again, another story that I came across this week was by Jimmy the Greek. Some of you that are older might have known Jimmy the Greek in America. He was a famous bookmaker and he was a football commentator and apparently pretty famous over there but in the 80s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and Jimmy the Greek. But apparently he made some comments that got him fired towards the African American athletes in the NFL, and he got fired in 1986 from CBS or CBN or whatever, what that was, that station. And one of his friends stood up for him and said, look, I know what he said sounded really awful, and this is in the 80s that he got fired. Like, we're not talking Black Lives Matter, we're talking back in the 80s, and he made these comments, and he says, I know that he sounds like those are horrendous comments, but he said, if you really knew him like I know him, he's actually not very educated. That's what his friend said. But he gets conscious, or he becomes self-conscious about this, and so he tries to act like he knows more than he does know, and then he puts his foot in it and just says stupid things, which is what he did in that particular case. And I was thinking, man, I know that. I've been there. I know exactly how that scenario can play out. That stupid things are said for no other reason than pride is kicked in and pride is engaging the tongue. And man, stupid things get said and you're trying to act like, man, I know some stuff here, when really you actually know nothing. I remember Josh said this just the other day. We're talking about conspiracy theories. And he said, I used to love talking about conspiracy theories. And he said, oh, man, I'd have all these opinions about, man, this and the money and the Bilderbergs and the whatever, and then I think he was talking, this is the conversation Josh and I had, he says he was talking about, at work, there was someone talking about vaccines and all the different things on the vaccines and all the things, and he says, I used to have an opinion because I realise now I actually don't really know anything about those subjects. And I know what he means. Like, how many people do you know sit down and have those conversations and it's like, oh yeah, and it's whatever it is, but it's like, do we really know those subjects? Do we really know all the ins and outs about it? But people love to delve into it and talk like as if they're an expert on those subjects. David says, I know what it's like to be like that, to be haughty and to have an opinion about everything. And he says, but God has weaned me out of that. That's what the next verse comes to. He says, surely I have behaved and quieted myself. Those two words are very interesting because he's saying, I was carrying on like a baby, making a whole lot of noise, but not really articulating anything. But I have grown up now, and I'm weaned off of that immaturity. And he says, behaved means this. It means to level and to equal. You say, what do you mean? To behave means to level or to equal. It's like to have this great big opinion, but it's kind of leveled off to an equal. It's not that he has no opinion. It's just leveled off and become equal. And it means to adjust. So he's adjusted how he responds and acts towards situations. And it quieted means to be dumb, to stop, to keep silence. He says, I've learned to shut my mouth. And all those things that I used to be worried about, and this is really what the key of the psalm is, it's weaned off of worry. Because in this particular context, he'd be thinking of all the scenarios and different world events that might have been playing into his life. Maybe when Saul was chasing him and he had an opinion about the situation of Saul and the kingdom and all of those things as a young man, 20 years old, 21, 22, opinions about everything. And anyone that came and spoke to him maybe talked about those things. But he says, man, I've learned that there is a lot of things. My heart is not haughty and my eye is not lofty. Neither do I exercise myself in great matters or in things too high for me. I've learnt, and he went through a very painful university degree. God put him through a 10-year university degree to get him prepared to be king, to take him from the sheepfold to the throne. 10 years of Saul and being on the run. He had to learn to trust God. And he says, over that time, God greatly humbled me, brought me to a place and a status. God allowed him to be at his pinnacle. We spoke about this before during the Psalms. His pinnacle was almost as David. When you think of David, what is the thing that comes to mind? What is the action, the deed that he did? David and Goliath. Well, he's like 16. Did you say something else? David and Bathsheba. That is not the heights, John. Can everyone go out? We're going to have a private one-on-one discussion here. No, Bathsheba was not the highlight of David's life. Goliath. But Goliath, you think, okay, David and Goliath. Man, that's the highlight. He's 16. And he's probably walking around as a 16-year-old, lifted up with a haughty, and he had ability. He led the armies. He was the general in Saul's army as a 20-year-old. Man, he probably was lifted up in pride and haughty. And God said, right, I'm going to cut you down a few levels here. And God brought him down to a place where he was usable by God. A 10-year university degree of the University of Hard Knocks brought on by God himself. And David says, I learnt some lessons here, and now I've learnt just to shut my mouth. Instead of having an opinion about how the kingdom should be run. In fact, he got to the place that when people came to him about Saul to kill him, he said, no, it's God's business. That's God. He could have said, yeah, get rid of him. He's doing things wrong. He's done this wrong and this wrong and this is wrong, and all pointed out all the faults of Saul. But he didn't do that. He got to a place where he said, you know what? Saul is God's man. God is well able to deal with him and to address the matters that are in Saul's life. And he shut his mouth. And that's hard. He says, I learnt that though. God, I have learnt that instead of having opinions about all the things that have taken place, he says, just to shut my mouth. I've leveled it off. I've become dumb. And I'm weaned off of this immaturity. Because it's not spiritual maturity that gives us an opinion about everything. And we want to delve into things that are too lofty and high for us. It's not spiritual maturity that is there. It's spiritual immaturity. When I was in Bible college, the Matt Farinella, which I didn't know at that particular stage, but that's Rhiannon's pastor's oldest son. So there's a connection there. But Matt Farinella was our RA, resident advisor, and he was in charge of the floor that I was on, about 40 guys or 50 guys. He was in charge, and he had about a couple of assistant RAs that kind of kept order in that dorm. He was a third year or a fourth year student. I think he was a fourth year student. And he put a verse in for us guys on that floor, and it was out of 1 Corinthians chapter number 13. And we used to recite it almost every night for a whole entire term, which says, when I was a child, I spake as a child, understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. And I still remember that because we would quote that as with all these 40, 18, 19, 20-year-olds that are in this particular dorm. And when we got to that part about, and when I became a man, I put away childish things. And it was just rousing every time we used to say it. And it stuck to me. It's like, you know what, there is. Paul does say, there's actions that are symbolic of children, and there are actions that are symbolic of adulthood and maturity. And David says, I used to worry about everything and have an opinion about all the affairs of what's going on. But he says, God has weaned me off of this type of lifestyle. He says, I have behaved and quieted myself. I've leveled off. I've equaled. I'm not so emotionally charged as I once was. In fact, you can see that in his life. Remember when Absalom was going to take the kingdom? He just said, man, these things are of God. Like, I'm not here to fight it. I'm not here to try it. I'm just going to go. And when he was leaving, Shimei met him. And Shimei was throwing rocks. And again, he said, you know what? Shimei's in God's business. I'm not here to throw rocks back. And he leveled off. He was humble by that stage. And he just left it with God. Surely I've behaved and quieted myself. I've shut up. I've learnt to shut up, he said. That's the humility that he's talking about. And he says, as a child that is weaned of his mother, my soul is even as a weaned child. I've been weaned off of this immaturity, the pride. God has weaned me off of this into this quiet state of humility. And he talks about two things. One is his humility that God has brought about in his life. He's not proud of his own humility. It's not like the old book that people always say, the proud person writes, that humility and how I attained it. Like, that's not what he's saying here. He's saying God has matured me. God is the one that's done this. He says, I have humility, and I'm not worried about everything that's going on, having an opinion and concerned about all the world events. He says, because I've learnt to just hope in God. And he's weaned off of ultimately worry and opinions about all the bad and negative things, and this is bad and this is bad and this is going to happen and this is. He says, man, let's leave it with God. And I hope that Israel hopes in God, like I've learnt to hope in God. And so the highest point, before we go to the last three of the actual temple, the highest point is actually low. And lowliness really is the highest point in the Christian life. Humility. If you've never read C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, don't buy the book, you don't have to buy the whole book. Go read his chapter on pride. The chapter on pride. You can Google it and you can find a free PDF. But C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, his chapter on pride, it is absolutely phenomenal work. It's the best thing I've read on the subject of pride. He learnt it. He says, I wish I could have gone further in humility. And anyone that goes down that path will say, you know what, there's so much. When I can get the pride out of my life, the humility is something that you realize, man, I'm getting closer to God here by getting rid of the self-centered nature of who I am. And David says that here, that it is. I'm weaned off of worry and all of those opinions, and my hope is in the Lord from now right on forever. It's a wonderful chapter. And he grows up, he weans himself through his maturity as he's progressed in the Christian life. We're over time again, 2 weeks in a row. This is amazing. I'll have just a couple of men tonight pray, and then I'll close in prayer. Just two men as God leads you, and then I'll close in prayer after those two men. Any two men, just stand and pray. Not on top of each other, obviously, and then close in prayer and we'll be dismissed to the supper room. But remember, in your own life, just pray for the requests that were given tonight. And the song leader there says choir after supper, after a tea or coffee, or sometime very quickly after he wants to run through the song. But yeah, let's have a couple of men pray, and then remember to pray for these requests, at least in your own private time when you get home. And if you're able to make it tomorrow at 5 o'clock, Josh and I will be here. We're going to have a time of prayer specifically about Sunday. Just two men as you lead, and I'll close in prayer.